The courtroom was full of people, but not for a big crime case or some famous politician. It was full because a rumor had spread all over the city. The rumor that Keanu Reeves, yes, the same famous movie star, was going to appear in court today. Not as a criminal, not as a lawyer, not even as a special guest, but as a normal witness for a poor immigrant family. People couldn't believe it. Why would a world-famous actor come to a small city courtroom for such a small case? People filled the benches, whispering and taking secret pictures with their phones. Some were excited, others just came to laugh. Many didn't believe it was real. Some even thought it was a prank or a scene for a movie being filmed. But it wasn't the moment Keanu Reeves quietly walked into the courtroom, dressed in plain dark clothes, wearing no sunglasses, no bodyguards. No media around him. Everyone went silent for a few seconds. It was really him, but he didn't look like a star. He looked like a quiet man there for something important. He didn't sit at the front. He didn't look for attention. He quietly walked over and sat beside an old woman and a boy in a wheelchair. The boy smiled at him. Keanu smiled back and placed his hand gently on the boy's shoulder. Some people noticed it and began whispering even more. Who is that family? Why is Keanu sitting with them? The judge hadn't entered yet, so the courtroom buzzed with energy. Everyone was waiting for something exciting to happen. Some people even laughed a little, thinking it was ridiculous that someone like Keanu would waste his time here. He's probably doing this for PR, someone whispered. Maybe it's for a new charity documentary, another person said, but none of them knew the real reason. Finally, the court doors opened, and Judge Harrison walked in with his usual serious face. He was known in the city for being strict and sarcastic. He didn't tolerate nonsense. He sat down, looked around the room. And when he saw Keanu Reeves, he paused. His face showed a tiny bit of surprise, but then he chuckled and shook his head. He opened the file in front of him and began reading out loud. This is the case of Gomez versus Beckett. Eviction case, rent issues. And hold on, Mr. Keanu Reeves, he said, looking over his glasses at Keanu. Is this real? Kay asked. And people started to laugh. The judge laughed too and leaned back in his chair. Mr. Reeves, what brings a man of your cinematic greatness to such a low-profile courtroom? The laughter in the room grew louder. The judge clearly found the situation amusing. But Keanu didn't laugh. He simply stood up and said, I'm here as a witness, Your Honor, in a calm and quiet voice. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't defensive. Just clear and respectful. Judge Harrison raised his eyebrows. Well, this should be fun, he muttered sarcastically and waved his hand. Sit down, Mr. Reeves. We'll hear your stories soon enough. Again, people giggled. Some even whispered jokes about John Wick taking on eviction cases. Keanu sat back down, not bothered by the jokes or the stares. The woman next to him, Mrs. Gomez, looked nervous. Her hands were shaking. The boy in the wheelchair clung to her dress. But Keanu leaned down and whispered something to the boy, who smiled again and relaxed. It was hard to believe a man like him was really there for people like them. Not because they didn't deserve help, but because no one ever cared this much. Not even neighbors, not even local politicians. And yet, here was a man known all over the world, sitting with them in silence, ready to speak for them. Even the reporters sitting in the back didn't know how to cover this moment. It wasn't some big dramatic entrance. It wasn't fame-hungry behavior. It was quiet, humble, and completely out of place in a room filled with people who expected drama. No one knew what Keanu was about to say, or what role he had in this simple case, but something about the way he sat there, so still, so focused, made the air feel heavy. Like everyone knew something important was coming. Even the judge, behind all his jokes, kept glancing at Keanu like he wasn't quite sure what to expect. And that's how it began. Not with a big speech, not with cameras flashing, but with silence, respect, and one small act of standing beside those who had no one else. Keanu Reeves, the man from movies, was now the man sitting beside a poor family in Troubleland, though most people didn't know it yet. His presence would soon shake more than just that courtroom. It would shake an entire nation and change lives forever, including his own. The courtroom was still buzzing when Judge Harrison looked directly at Keanu and raised one eyebrow with a smirk on his face. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, then said in a loud, playful voice, "So, Mr. Reeves, are you filming a new courtroom drama, or are you actually serious about being here?" The crowd chuckled again, louder this time, and the judge laughed along with them, clearly enjoying himself. He wasn't angry or rude, just sarcastic. The kind of man who thought every situation could use a joke, even serious ones. He tilted his head and continued, "A man like you, with millions of dollars, hundreds of fans, a big house in the hills. What's your connection with this family and their rent problem?" Keanu stood up again, calm as ever. He looked straight at the judge. His face was peaceful. Not proud or annoyed, just firm. "I'm here to support them, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. "They're my friends." Again, people giggled. The judge chuckled too. "Friends," he said, pretending to be shocked. "Do you often make friends in poor neighborhoods, Mr. Reeves? Or was this a one-time act of kindness for the cameras?" Now the laughter from the crowd had a bit of mockery in it. A few people shook their heads, whispering things like, "He's just showing off," or "probably doing this for headlines." Even the court clerk tried to hide a smile behind her hand. But Keanu stayed still, his eyes calm. He didn't fire back, didn't get angry. He simply said, "Sometimes the people who need the most help have the quietest voices." His words were soft, but they echoed in the courtroom like thunder. It grew quiet again. The smirk slowly faded from a few faces. The judge leaned back in his chair, the smile still there, but smaller now. "All right then," he said, "let's hear this story of yours." He called the first lawyer to speak. It was the family's legal aid lawyer, a young woman named Farah, who looked nervous but determined. She stood up, walked to the center, and began telling the story of the Gomez family. Mrs. Gomez was a widow who had come to the country many years ago with her husband and little boy. They worked long hours in factories and cleaning jobs, saving every coin they could to provide a simple life for their disabled son. 2 years ago, her husband passed away from a heart attack, leaving her alone to care for the boy. The landlord of their apartment had recently raised the rent without warning, and when she couldn't pay, he gave her a notice to leave within 10 days. No mercy, no time to find a place. They were about to be thrown out with nowhere to go, and her son, who could barely move, needed medical equipment and care. Farah pointed toward Keanu, then told the judge, "He met them by accident, sir," she explained. Mrs. Gomez had taken her son on a bus ride, just to make him feel less trapped, but the boy's wheelchair wheel got stuck in the train station's stair ramp, and everyone kept walking past, except him. The judge listened quietly now. "No jokes, no sarcasm," she continued. "Mr. Reeves helped free the chair, waited until they got safely on the bus, and later came to visit them. Not once, but many times. Secretly, he helped pay their rent, brought groceries, even fixed their broken heater himself. Never took photos, never called the press." Some people in the courtroom began looking surprised now. A few looked embarrassed. Farah took a small envelope from her file and handed it to the clerk. "Here are receipts for the rent, grocery store bills, and handwritten notes from Mr. Reeves, showing his quiet support." The judge opened the envelope and read some of the papers. His smile was gone now. He looked serious, thoughtful even. He looked up at Keanu again and asked, "So, you're saying all of this was just kindness? Nothing in return?" Keanu nodded. "Just kindness," he said. "That's all it was meant to be." There was silence. A long, heavy silence. Even the people who were laughing before were now quiet. Some shifted in their seats, others looked down. It was a strange moment, awkward for some, inspiring for others. Then Judge Harrison cleared his throat, trying to bring back some control in the room, but his voice was different now. Mocking, not playful, just low and thoughtful. "Well, Mr. Reeves, we'll continue with the evidence. But let me just say, this Hollywood rarely walks into my courtroom, and when it does, it usually asks for favors, not gives them." Keanu simply bowed his head slightly and sat down again. The boy in the wheelchair grabbed his hand and squeezed it. Mrs. Gomez had tears in her eyes, but tried to hide them by looking down. The judge moved on to the next part of the case, but the tone of the courtroom had changed. Something felt different. Now, people weren't there just to stare at a movie star anymore. They were beginning to see the story of a quiet man who showed up not to be seen, but to help, and in that silence, a small shift began in the hearts of those watching, because true kindness, when it speaks, doesn't need to shout, just needs to be seen once, honestly, and it touches something in everyone, even the judge who had once laughed. The courtroom lights buzzed softly as everyone waited for the next part of the hearing to begin, but the mood was not the same as before. Earlier, people were smiling, whispering, even laughing when Keanu Reeves had walked in. But now, there was a kind of quiet respect in the air. People were listening more closely, paying attention. Even the judge was no longer smirking. Farah, the family's lawyer, took a deep breath and continued her explanation. She said, "This case is not just about unpaid rent. It's about something deeper, something that could happen to anyone who falls on hard times." She walked slowly across the courtroom floor, looking at the judge. The Gomez family has never asked for help from anyone before, never broken any laws, never missed a payment till the father passed away. She explained how Mrs. Gomez and her husband had moved from Mexico many years ago, both working in cleaning jobs, sometimes 2 shifts a day. They had one son, David, who was born with a condition that made it hard for him to walk or move without help. They loved him more than anything and did everything to give him a normal life. But then, everything changed when Mr. Gomez died of a heart attack while working. Late one night, the loss broke the family in more ways than one. Mrs. Gomez was left alone to care for her disabled child, and the little savings they had began to disappear quickly. Hospital bills, rent, food, medicine, all became too much as Farah spoke. Many in the courtroom looked at the boy in the wheelchair. He was no longer smiling, just staring down at his hands folded in his lap. Keanu gently patted his shoulder, giving him strength without saying a word. Farah continued. One day, Mrs. Gomez tried to give her son something special, a small outing, a simple trip outside so he could see the world beyond their small apartment. She paused, and that's when she met Mr. Reeves. Everyone in the courtroom looked at Keanu again, and this time, there was no judgment, just curiosity. Respect. Even Farah explained that it had started in a subway station. The wheelchair's front wheel had gotten stuck on a ramp. People walked by without looking. Some even stepped over them. Mrs. Gomez was panicking, and David was crying. That's when Keanu stepped in, wearing a hoodie and jeans. No cameras, no bodyguards. Just a man who saw a mother struggling and stopped to help. He helped free the chair, bought the boy a warm drink from a nearby stand, and sat with them for 15 minutes, just talking to David about his favorite cartoons. It could have ended there. Just a good deed for the day, but it didn't. Keanu didn't forget them. Farah told the court that 3 days later, Keanu visited their apartment. He brought bags of groceries, a toolbox to fix their broken heater, and even a new cushion for the wheelchair. Mrs. Gomez was shocked. She didn't understand why a big star like him would care about them, but Keanu never acted like a star. He came back again, sometimes just to check in, sometimes to drop off food or medicine. Always quietly, always respectfully, never with cameras. Never expecting thanks, one day, Mrs. Gomez finally asked him, "Why are you doing this for us?" And Keanu's answer was simple: "Because someone once helped me when I had no one." Farrah told the courtroom how Keanu never talked about his personal life, but everyone knew parts of it: how he had lost his best friend, his child, and his partner; how he lived a quiet life despite being famous; how he gave away millions but never spoke about it. Mrs. Gomez was grateful beyond words. But things got worse when their landlord gave them a notice to leave the apartment in 10 days, claiming late rent. Even though they had paid most of it with Keanu's help, Farrah explained, "We believe the landlord wanted them out so he could raise the rent for the next tenant," something that happens often in poor areas. But what he didn't count on was that someone like Keanu Reeves would stand with this family in court. Now the judge was listening carefully, flipping through papers, looking more serious than before. "So you're saying Mr. Reeves paid part of the rent himself?" he asked. Farrah nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, and not just once, but several times, without being asked." Without expecting anything in return, Keanu stood up slowly and added, "I never intended to come to court, but when the family was threatened with eviction, I couldn't stay quiet. They don't deserve this." His voice was calm but powerful. Even people in the back row leaned forward to hear every word. "They've suffered enough. They don't need pity. They need fairness." He said. There was a pause in the room. No one spoke for a while. Then Judge Harrison looked at Keanu, and for the first time his expression softened. Not completely, but enough to notice. He said quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Reeves, for explaining your role. We'll now move to the next part of the case." As Keanu sat back down, a woman in the gallery wiped tears from her eyes. A man beside her whispered, "I can't believe this is the same guy from the movies." But the truth was, Keanu wasn't acting. He wasn't playing a role. He was just being human, and in a world full of noise and fame. That simple act of standing beside a forgotten family had already started to touch more hearts than any film ever could. The courtroom felt quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are thinking deeply. Judge Harrison tapped his pen on the wooden bench, eyes still fixed on the papers in front of him. His earlier smirks and sarcastic jokes were gone. Now he looked serious, maybe even confused. He leaned back in his chair and looked straight at Keanu. "So let me ask again," he said slowly. "You helped this family, paid their rent, brought food, medicine, and never once went to the press." Keanu nodded. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just wanted to help." The judge raised an eyebrow. "That's hard to believe, Mr. Reeves," he replied. "In my experience, celebrities usually come with a camera crew, especially when they're helping the poor." The courtroom stayed silent. Some people nodded quietly. Others looked at Keanu, waiting to see if he would get angry or defend himself loudly. But he didn't. He just stood still, hands by his side, calm and composed. "Your Honor," Keanu said softly, "I've seen what happens when people suffer alone. I've seen what it means to lose everything and have no one to turn to." His voice didn't rise, but it carried emotion. "This family reminded me of that, and I didn't want them to feel forgotten." For a moment, the judge didn't say anything. His fingers stopped tapping. His eyes slowly moved from Keanu to Mrs. Gomez, then to the boy, David, who sat in the wheelchair, looking small, scared, and tired. The judge leaned forward and sighed. "I have to admit, this is unusual. Not just the case, but your involvement," he said. "You're not legally required to be here, are you?" "No, sir," Keanu said. "But I made a promise to David. I told him I wouldn't let them be pushed around just because they were quiet, just because they weren't rich." A quiet murmur went through the room again. Not laughter this time, but surprise, maybe even a bit of shame for those who had laughed before. or doubted his reasons, Judge Harrison looked down at the papers again, then turned his attention to the landlord's lawyer, who had been sitting with his arms crossed this whole time. "Mr. Beckett," the judge said, "would you like to speak?" The lawyer stood, straightened his tie, and walked to the center. "Your Honor, this is a very simple case," he said confidently. "The family did not pay the rent in full for 3 months. My client gave them legal notice and followed all the rules of eviction." He paused and added, "Mr. Reeves' personal opinions, while touching, do not change the facts." The judge nodded. "Continue." "The landlord has every right to remove tenants who cannot pay," the lawyer said. "And frankly, allowing emotional stories to cloud a legal decision would set a bad example." He glanced at Keanu, even if that story comes from a famous actor. Keanu didn't respond, but his jaw tightened slightly. Farah, the family's lawyer, stood up again. "Your Honor, we agree that the law must be followed," she said. "But we must also look at the full picture. This is not a case of lazy tenants refusing to pay. This is a struggling single mother doing everything she can with support from someone who chose to care." The judge looked thoughtful. His fingers rested on his chin. Then he asked, "Mr. Beckett, how much of the rent was unpaid exactly?" The landlord's lawyer opened his file. "Roughly $700. Your Honor, just $700. The judge asked, surprised, "Yes, but over multiple months." The lawyer added quickly, "It adds up." The judge looked at Keanu again. "And you could have just paid that entire amount and walked away, right?" "I could have," Keanu said, "but that wouldn't solve the problem." "What do you mean?" "I mean, if I disappear, they still face the same system that pushes people like them to the edge." Keanu replied, "I didn't want to be a silent wallet. I wanted to stand beside them, because too many people like them get pushed aside without being seen." Judge Harrison leaned back. Silent again. People in the room were no longer doubting. They were watching with respect. Even the court officers stood straighter, more alert. The mood had changed completely from when the hearing began. One elderly woman in the back wiped her tears with a tissue. She had come just to see the movie star, but now she whispered to the person beside her, "He's different. He's not like other celebrities." The judge finally spoke. "This is a court of law, Mr. Reeves," he said firmly. "But today, I see something that the law books don't teach: character." He turned to the landlord's lawyer. "We will continue reviewing the eviction papers, but I also want time to consider the ethical weight of this testimony." The gavel hit the desk softly. "We'll take a short recess." Everyone stood. As the judge left the bench, Keanu sat down again beside the Gomez family. David looked up at him, his eyes wide. "Did we do okay?" the boy asked in a whisper. Keanu smiled and gently ruffled his hair. "You did great, kid," he said. "No matter what happens, you're not alone anymore." And in that moment, even without a final verdict, it was clear to everyone in the room that something special had already happened. It's a kind of quiet power that doesn't need permission to change hearts. When the judge called for a short break, everyone stood quietly, but their minds were full of thoughts. Some people left the courtroom to get coffee or fresh air, while others stayed seated, whispering softly to one another. Most of them weren't talking about the case anymore. They were talking about Keanu Reeves. "Did you see the way he talked?" Someone said, "He didn't act like a celebrity at all." Another replied, "I came to laugh," whispered one man. "But now, I feel kind of ashamed." In the far back of the courtroom, a young woman had secretly taken a short video clip when Keanu spoke about standing beside people who are forgotten. She hadn't planned to post it, but the words stuck in her mind like glue. And without thinking too much, she uploaded the clip to social media with the caption, "Keanu Reeves shows up in court not for himself, but to defend a poor family from eviction. No cameras, no PR, just kindness." She locked her phone and didn't even check again for an hour. But while the court took a short break, something strange was happening outside the building. The video began to spread, first to her friends, then to strangers, then to local reporters. Within 2 hours, it was trending on multiple platforms. People started resharing it with hashtags like hashtag Keanu in court, hashtag kindness is power, and hashtag real hero. Big news pages reposted the video, calling it a reminder that decency still exists. Journalists from large TV channels began to call the local court, asking if the story was true. Inside the courtroom, Keanu had no idea what was happening. He sat quietly beside Mrs. Gomez and her son David, who leaned into him. For comfort, "Why is everyone staring at us now?" David asked quietly. Keanu smiled. "Sometimes people listen when they see someone care." Outside the building, a small group of people started to gather with cameras and microphones. Not many at first, but by the end of the lunch break, the news vans were arriving too. Back inside, the court was ready to begin again. Judge Harrison walked in, now more serious, more thoughtful, maybe even a little unsure how to continue. He had seen the change in the courtroom, felt the weight in the air. Something was different now as everyone settled back into their seats. The judge glanced at Keanu and asked, "Are you aware that your words have now reached over 500,000 people?" Keanu looked confused. "No, sir," he said. "There's a video," the judge explained. "And it's gone viral." Keanu nodded slowly, then said simply, "That wasn't my plan. I know." The judge replied, "That's what makes it powerful." People in the courtroom looked at one another, some smiling softly, others blinking in surprise. It was strange how fast the world could react to something real. Then the judge spoke to the landlord's lawyer again. "Mr. Beckett, I understand. The law is on your side technically," he said. "But tell me, how much longer does your client plan to leave the apartment vacant after this family is removed?" The lawyer paused, caught off guard. "I'm not sure, Your Honor, because I checked," the judge said firmly. "And this apartment is scheduled for renovation, meaning it won't be rented out for at least another 6 months." The courtroom whispered again. This meant the eviction was not urgent. It wasn't even necessary. The judge leaned forward. "You know what I think, Mr. Beckett?" "No, sir. I think your client wants to push this family out so he can raise the rent when the unit is shiny and new," the judge said coldly. "But I'm not going to let that happen, not today." Mrs. Gomez covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide in disbelief. David gripped Keanu's arm tighter. Farah, their lawyer, let out a quiet breath of relief. "I'm placing a temporary block on the eviction." The judge continued until the city finds a better solution, or unless new evidence is brought forward. Gasps filled the courtroom. Someone clapped quietly in the back, but stopped when the judge looked up. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked at Mrs. Gomez, who was already crying silently. "Thank you," she whispered to him. And he just smiled and nodded. This wasn't the end of the legal fight, but it was a big step, a pause in the suffering, a chance to breathe, a window of hope as the hearing ended. People stood again. But this time, it wasn't for drama or entertainment. They stood in respect, not only for the judge's decision, but for the quiet power of a man who didn't want to be a hero, but became one anyway. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras ready, but Keanu didn't go out the front door. Instead, he slipped out the side exit with the family, just as quietly as he had entered. No interview. Someone called out, "No thank you," he said with a soft smile. "It's not my story to tell." And just like that, he was gone again, not chasing the spotlight, but leaving behind something far brighter than fame, hope. After the judge stopped the eviction and ordered a delay, the courtroom slowly emptied. But people were no longer whispering or laughing. Instead, they were quiet, thoughtful, even respectful. Some of them had come just to see a famous face, but now they had seen something far greater, real kindness outside the courthouse. The news was spreading like wildfire. social media exploded with posts. News anchors were now talking about Keanu Reeves not for a new movie, but for what he did in a small courtroom for a poor family across the country. People shared the video clip of Keanu speaking softly in court, standing beside the wheelchair-bound boy and his mother. He didn't need to be there, one news reporter said on live TV. But he showed up anyway, and the world listened. Another said, but while everyone was talking, praising, and sharing online, Keanu himself stayed completely silent. He didn't post anything, didn't give interviews, didn't make a video thanking the public. He didn't even release a statement. He simply went back to his quiet life, ignoring all the noise. News fans waited outside his home. Some even tried to follow his car, but he didn't respond. He didn't shout. He didn't hide. He just lived as he always had, quietly, simply, without a show. When one reporter asked him directly, "Why won't you say anything to the public? This is your moment," he simply answered, "It was never about me." Back at Mrs. Gomez's apartment, things started to slowly get better. The fear of being thrown out had lessened, though the legal case was still not over. David started smiling more, eating better, even sleeping without crying at night. Mrs. Gomez, though still nervous, had hope in her eyes now. She began fixing up small things in the home, making it cleaner, more cheerful, as if preparing to stay longer, to build a safe place again. And every few days, Keanu would stop by, not with cameras, not with gifts, but just to check in. Sometimes he brought a bag of fresh fruit, sometimes a book for David, and sometimes just himself. A quiet friend who sat down at the kitchen table, asked how they were doing, and listened. Really listened. Farah, their lawyer, was shocked one day when Keanu walked into the legal aid office and handed her an envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "For the clinic," he said, "so you can help more people like them." It was a donation, a large one, but he didn't ask for a receipt, didn't want his name listed on any wall. Just a nod and a quiet thank you was enough. The head of the clinic later told her, "In all my years, I've never seen something like this. Most rich people donate for tax breaks or for their names to be remembered." Farah smiled. "He doesn't want to be remembered," she said. "He just wants to help." Meanwhile, the internet was still busy. Artists began drawing pictures of Keanu beside a small boy in a wheelchair. Teachers printed quotes from his court speech and posted them in classrooms. One quote stood out. "Sometimes the people who need the most help have the quietest voices." People around the country began doing small acts of kindness in his name, paying for strangers' meals, helping the homeless, supporting local families with rent and groceries. Some called it the Keanu effect, but Keanu never mentioned it. He never claimed it, never said a word about any of it. He didn't want credit, because for him, true kindness should be quiet, he once told Mrs. Gomez during a tea visit. Helping people isn't about being famous. It's about being human, and that stayed with her. It stayed with David too, who began telling everyone at school, "Keanu Reeves is my friend." The kids didn't believe him at first, until one day, Keanu showed up at the school quietly to attend David's small art show. Kute stood in the back, didn't take photos, just clapped quietly and hugged David when it was over. The teachers didn't even know he was there until afterward. Later that day, one teacher said, "I've never seen a kid so happy." Not because Keanu Reeves is famous, but because he made him feel seen. Far away, in studios and offices, people tried to make money from the story. Some wanted to turn it into a film, others into a book. But every time someone contacted Keanu, his answer was the same: no. He didn't want to sell the moment. He didn't want to turn kindness into a product. All he wanted was for the family to be safe, for the boy to grow up smiling, and for the world to remember that even a small act of goodness, if done quietly, can echo forever. And though he had disappeared again from the headlines, the story didn't die. It lived in people's hearts. It lived in Mrs. Gomez's laughter, in David's confidence, in the way Farah handled future clients with more care. It lived not as a story of a star but as a story of a man who reminded the world that decency still matters, even in silence, especially in silence. Days turned into weeks. But the memory of what happened in that small courtroom didn't fade. Not for the people who were there. And not for the people who had watched the video online, even though Keanu Reeves had returned to his quiet life. His name kept coming up in news stories, radio shows, and even school classrooms. People called him a real hero, a quiet legend, and the kind of human we all should be. But Keanu never spoke about it again while the world talked. He stayed silent. He didn't give interviews, didn't attend talk shows, and didn't post anything on social media. To him, the spotlight wasn't important. The family was. And that's all that mattered still. Reporters tried to find ways to talk about the story. Some tried to reach Mrs. Gomez. Others even went to David's school. But they all got the same polite answer. "We're thankful," Mrs. Gomez once said kindly. But this is not a movie. This is our real life inside their small apartment. Things were slowly getting better. The rent was now being covered, with support from the community and a local charity that stepped in after seeing the story online. The landlord, who had once tried to evict them, had backed off, afraid of the attention. And the city was now helping Mrs. Gomez apply for a long-term housing program. David had a new wheelchair, now lightweight, easy to move, and comfortable lit. Had been paid for by Keanu quietly through a medical charity. He didn't tell them, but they knew it was him. The delivery form didn't have his name, but it had a simple note: "For the boy who reminds me what courage looks like." David smiled when he read it. He still cares, he said to his mother, and she nodded, wiping a tear one afternoon. As rain gently tapped against the window, Mrs. Gomez was cooking soup, and David sat drawing at the table. There was a soft knock on the door, not loud, not rushed, just polite when Mrs. Gomez opened it. There stood Keanu again, in his usual jeans and jacket, holding a small paper bag with warm bread. "Just thought you might want something fresh," he said. Mrs. Gomez smiled brightly and hugged him gently. "You always come at the right time." They sat together at the kitchen table, eating quietly, laughing about David's new art, talking about small things like movies, food, and books. Not court cases or news stories, just normal human things. Later, Mrs. Gomez told him, "You didn't just save us from eviction. You brought us back to life." Keanu smiled, but said nothing. Instead, he handed her a folded paper and stood to leave. "If you ever need anything, just call," he said softly after he left. She opened the paper. Was a list of contacts: lawyers, clinics, schools, and housing officials, all people who were ready to help her if she needed support. Keanu had quietly built a small safety net around them without them even knowing. Meanwhile, at the courtroom where it all began, Judge Harrison was not the same man anymore. People noticed he was less sarcastic now, less quick to judge. Something had changed in him that day. He often thought about the trial. The moment Keanu said, "They don't need pity, they need fairness." One day, during a law school lecture, he was invited to speak about unusual courtroom moments. He told the students, "There was a day a movie star walked into my courtroom and taught me more about justice than any textbook ever did." He didn't say Keanu's name, but everyone knew who he meant. Farah, the young lawyer who had once been nervous standing in court, had now become stronger, more confident. She continued working at the Legal Aid Center and helped many more families like the Gomez family. She told her coworkers, "If Keanu Reeves could take time to stand beside people who had no one, then we can too. We don't need to be rich, just willing." The story of what happened had become more than just a viral moment. It became a seed planted in the hearts of people everywhere, inspiring small acts of kindness. Different cities, strangers started paying strangers rent. Students created kindness clubs in schools. Artists painted murals of Keanu and David with the words, "Be kind, be present, be human." And all this time, Keanu kept living quietly, never accepting awards for what he did, never using it for fame. He had disappeared from the headlines, but his actions had stayed behind, like soft footprints in the world. That others could follow. One evening, David was lying in bed, holding a photo of the three of them, him, his mom, and Keanu. Sitting in the tiny living room, smiling. "Do you think he'll come again?" David asked sleepily. Mrs. Gomez kissed his forehead and said, "Maybe. But even if he doesn't, he already gave us what we needed the most." "What's that?" David asked. "A reason to believe people still care." She said, "On with that." The boy fell asleep, smiling, holding the photo like a treasure because sometimes heroes don't wear capes. They wear old jackets, carry paper bags of bread, and knock softly on doors without asking for anything in return. They leave behind warmth, hope, and the belief that even the quietest kindness can change a life forever. Months passed quietly, and life slowly returned to normal. But something had changed, not just for the Gomez family, but for everyone who had followed their story. People still remembered the day Keanu Reeves walked into a small courtroom, not to act, not to promote anything, but just to help someone who needed a hand. Mrs. Gomez and David were still living in the same apartment, but it no longer felt cold and scary. It felt like home again. The fear of eviction was gone. The walls were painted, the heater worked, and there was food on the table. It wasn't because of magic, it was because someone chose to care when he didn't have to. David now had a new group of friends at school. Kids who used to ignore him now invited him to play games. He even started drawing again and won a small art contest for his school. The theme was what kindness looks like, and David drew a man helping a boy in a wheelchair, handing him a sandwich with one hand and holding an umbrella over him with the other. When his teacher asked, "Is that your dad?" David smiled and replied, "No, he's my friend and my hero." Mrs. Gomez started working again, part-time at a local library. And every weekend, she volunteered at a food pantry, helping other families in need. When someone asked her why she did it, she simply said, "Because I was helped. Now it's my turn to help someone else." As for Keanu, he stayed the same, quiet, humble, and kind. He never gave interviews, never wrote a book about what happened, never allowed anyone to make a movie about the court case. People tried, but he always refused. One big director even offered him millions to turn the courtroom moment into a blockbuster film. But Keanu replied, "Some stories are better left in the hearts of those who lived them." Still, his actions kept inspiring. People all over the world, strangers, began doing kind things in his name. Some paid off others' debts, some bought groceries for families, and others donated to schools and shelters without wanting their names mentioned. They didn't call it charity, they called it Keanu-style kindness. Even the judge, Mr. Harrison, had changed. People who once feared his sarcasm now found him softer, more understanding. He had started a new program in his court for first-time eviction cases, connecting families with support before throwing them out on the street. He often remembered Keanu's words, "They don't need pity. They need fairness." He began ending each court week by telling his staff, "Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sits quietly and listens." Farah, the young lawyer, became a local hero too. She gave talks at schools, law colleges, and shelters, teaching about courage, law, and the power of standing beside people. She always ended her speech by saying, "I learned the law in books, but I learned humanity from a man who said nothing and did everything." One day, almost a year later, Mrs. Gomez received a small package at her door. There was no sender name, just a note inside that read, "For David. Tell him to keep dreaming." Inside the box was a set of high-quality drawing supplies, sketchbooks, colored pencils, and a small framed print of one of David's art contest drawings. She didn't have to ask who sent it. She knew David placed the drawing on his bedroom. Walland whispered, "He didn't forget me." But the most touching moment came quietly and unexpectedly one evening. Mrs. Gomez and David visited the court building just to walk around the area. David pointed toward the building and said, "That's where everything changed." As they turned to leave, they noticed something new, a small bronze plaque near the front steps of the courthouse. It wasn't large, not flashy, just simple and elegant. It read, "In honor of quiet kindness, and those who show up not to be seen, but to stand beside others." There was no name on the plaque, but Mrs. Gomez smiled as tears filled her eyes. "He'll never let them write his name," she whispered, "but we'll always know it was him." And in that quiet corner of the city, the legacy of one man lived on, not through awards, not through trophies, but through the lives he touched, the hearts he opened, and the hope he gave. David often told his story at school whenever he met new students. "When I was almost thrown out of my home, a famous man saved us. Did he beat up the bad guy?" Kids would ask. "No," David replied with a smile. "He just stood beside us." And that was enough. And so, the story of Keanu Reeves didn't end in a courtroom. It didn't end on a screen or in a book. It kept going quietly in the lives of those who had been changed by it, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not shout, not fight, not show off, but simply walk in. Take a seat beside someone and stay when it matters the most. That's what he did, and that's why no one would ever forget him, not because he was famous, but because he was good.